one that would be impossible without the contributions of many and the focused work of a handful of people in particular. It's barely 3 months since we realized we would have to pivot from our plan to hold the event in Indianapolis, and now we are here. I mean those air quotes, gathering together from our offices, homes, and nearby secure Wi-Fi feeds. That word virtual has come in most of our recent context to suggest something that is almost, something that is not quite, something that is virtually what we were hoping to do, and therefore something that falls short of that hope. But the word itself is related to the word virtue. It has a connection to something grounded in a moral imperative, in a good to which we all aspire. MELUS itself, as a society, aspires to the virtue that the stories of all Americans matter. We believe in recovering, interrogating, and celebrating those stories that have often been overlooked in the larger narrative of the American experience. We believe that the multi-ethnic produces multiples, that the America we can glimpse from a harmony of different voices is stronger than an America that imagines itself great in a monochromatic nostalgia. In this time of pandemic then, when so many of us hunger to connect and reconnect with fellow scholars, it's a virtue to be together even in this virtual fashion. For most of us, this is deceptively easy. We haven't even had to cancel classes as we've just carved out time to sit in front of our screens and enjoy robust academic conversation. So before we move on to a series of awards and then of course our keynote, I want to be sure to take a moment to thank the people who've borne the heaviest weight of making this experience not just a virtual reality, but a real virtue, a much needed chance for all of us to be together in this strange, yet I hope welcoming manner. Stella Setka, our MELUS program chair, served as one half of the Tandem Point team. She's been amazing throughout her tenure on the executive committee, and she's been even more remarkable in the last couple months. So can I ask for a quick round of virtual applause for Stella? So it's hard to see how many people are applauding, but Stella, thank you so much. Amazing. The other half of that tandem has been Anastasia Stacy Lynn, whom I cannot thank enough. Stacy's the inspiration and the central load carrier for the MELUS Monthly that's done so much to keep us in touch with one another over the last few years. She's been an extraordinary MELUS secretary for all 6 years I've had the privilege to be president, and she's been the recent institutional memory of who we are as a society. I'm not exaggerating when I say that this conference would not have happened without her. I was with her virtually when we held the meeting where it became apparent that we could not hold an in-person conference. It took her less than 30 seconds to realize that we would have to shoulder the burden of putting on this event. And she understood immediately that however much we would do, she would be the person on whom the heaviest weight fell. Please, if you will, give Stacy a round of applause for more work than any of us can imagine, performed with clear and consistent generosity and grace. So, yeah, it's amazing stuff. And finally, Stacy tells me, and I've come to see for myself in the closing days of the planning, how wonderful some of her colleagues at the University of North Georgia have been in this effort as well. So please, may I ask you to acknowledge Allison Grundell and Mandy Lucido as well. Thanks, everybody. And so we have a couple of awards to begin with. Kaylee, I don't see you in Zoom land, but I know that you're here.
I'm here, Joe.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. So it's my pleasure, as it has been for the last 3 years, to present our MELUS Travel Award winners for this year. I was trying to look through Zoom land to find them. I hope they are here. But before I present the winners, I'd like to thank Elena Kaus from the Conference Planning Committee and Christina Stanchu from the MELUS Executive Committee for their service to MELUS on the Travel Awards Committee. Elena and Christina and I reviewed many impressive abstracts. I think perhaps more than I ever had in the 3 years that I've been in this position. And it was really difficult to choose only 3 for awards. So thank you, Christina and Elena, for your help in this. So in support of the professional development and growth toward the future of the academic study of multi-ethnic literature, the MELUS Graduate Student Travel Award supports 2 current graduate students who are presenting at this year's conference. We can't give them a formal award, a piece of paper this year, but I would love to see you again next year and give you the actual paper and shake your hand for real. I'm pleased to announce that this year's awards go to Hollis Druett for his exceptional essay proposal on Blackness and Indigeneity, or The Shape That Freedom Might Take, a brief field survey and paired reading of Citizen and Whereas. And to Eunice Toe for her innovative essay proposal, Blackness, the Underground, and Quotidian Fugitivity in Pauline Hopkins, Winona. Please accept our congratulations, and the audience may feel free to applaud via the reaction button or in the chat.
That's terrific.
Oh, I've got one more, Joe. In addition, I'm also pleased to announce that the MELUS President's Contingent Faculty Award goes to Jessica Fitzpatrick for her exceptional essay proposal, The Right to Space, Reimagining Citizenship in Anders and Onyebuchi. Please accept our congratulations, Jessica. Again, the audience may feel free to applaud via the reaction or chat button.
Maya?
Hi, thank you, Joe. Each year, the MELUS Journal gives out an award for the best essay of the year, the Catherine Newman Best Essay Award. The journal has been at the vanguard of publishing cutting-edge and superbly written articles that advance the study of multi-ethnic American literatures, and the essays published in 2020 were no exception to this. Before I announce the winner of the award, I'd like to name and thank this year's judges who selected the winning essay out of over 30 excellent articles. Along with myself, the judges were Martha Cutter, Mauricio Espinosa, and Mazen Nawas. And I don't know if they're here out there in one of those boxes, but the winner of this year's Catherine Newman Best Essay Award is Gina B. Kim for the essay entitled Toward an Infrastructural Sublime, Narrating Interdependency in Karen Tay Yamashita's Los Angeles, published in the summer 2020 issue of the journal. The judges remarked that Kim's essay carefully dissects Yamashita's Tropic of Orange to offer compelling evidence for an analysis based on the theory of interdependency. The analysis is innovative, imaginative, and provides potential for further application of this theory in narrative, film, and graphic novels. Additionally, the writing is fluid and enjoyable. So without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to present this award to Gina. If I could reach through the internet, Gina, I would hand it to you. But congratulations, wonderful work. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. One more award. I was going to say, one of the privileges of being part of the MELUS Executive Committee is the opportunity to have a voice in nominating someone for the MELUS Distinguished Award for contributions to the society. The idea behind that award is to acknowledge people who have contributed their energy to the society, who have made it possible for successive generations of scholars to come together in our conferences and through the journal. Mary Jo Bona exemplifies what it means to serve this society so that others can move forward with their own scholarship. For those of you who do not know, Mary Jo is a pillar of ethnic and gender studies at SUNY Stony Brook, where she's incoming as the Associate Dean for Faculty Affairs in the College of Arts and Sciences. She serves as the chair of the Department of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies and is affiliated with the Department of English as well. Her most recent book is Women Writing Cloth, Migratory Fictions in the American Imaginary from 2016. And she's remained an active scholar at the same time as she's performed such institutional and disciplinary service. As a personal point, I'm one of the beneficiaries of her capacity for nurturing younger scholars. Back at a time when I had most reason to doubt my own career, she and her co-editor Irma Maney asked if I could develop a conference paper into a chapter for their edited collection, Multi-Ethnic Literature in the Canon Debates. That vote of confidence helped me get through a period of professional crisis, and it cemented my sense of obligation to see what I could do for others who might be in similarly challenging moments. As it turns out, that collection is full of contributions from then young scholars, many others who have gone on to become regulars at MELUS, and people who have worked to emulate Mary Jo's perpetual generosity. We don't give this award every year. Mary Jo's been at the top of my list for this honor for the last 2 or 3 years, and because of scheduling challenges in the pandemic, it's taken a while to be able to make this official. Mary Jo is the winner of the 2021 MELUS Distinguished Award for Contributions to Society. And I ask you please to give a virtual, or if you want to unmute and let out a shout, because with Mary Jo, there's always a lot of joy. Not so virtual round of applause. So.
You go.
There you go.
Well done.
Thank you.
Yeah, your plaque may actually say 2020 on it. I have a physical plaque, which I will mail you. But but it could say 2020 on it. But
It's okay, Kim. I'll come
All right.
down next year and get it.
all right, perfect.
Excellent. So this has been really a joy to be able to be together in this strange and virtual way, and I'm so excited to have now our keynote moment. As we get ready for that keynote conversation, the last honor that falls to me is to introduce someone who, in this room, whether virtual or real, needs no introduction. John Lowe is the Barbara Methvin Professor in the Department of English at the University of Georgia. He has served as the president of MELUS and is the recipient of the MELUS Lifetime Achievement Award for outstanding contributions to the field of ethnic American literatures. And as one of many people in this room with the good fortune to have known John a long time, I can say as well that he is a mensch. So, John, welcome. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And thank you, Joe, for your stellar service as our president all these years, and particularly during this last difficult year. Let me dial back a few decades, more decades than I really want to admit, to when I was a graduate student at Columbia. My friend John Turnbull and I were really upset for a long time because there were no courses on African American literature. And so one day John ran up to me in the hallway of Philosophy Hall and he said, John, I've got good news and I've got bad news. I said, well, what's the good news? They're going to have a seminar on African American literature next term. I said, great, what's the bad news? They've hired a German hippie to teach it. And when he showed up, though, I myself, believe it or not, had a lot of hair, long hair, and a beard back then. And so when our long-haired new professor showed up in his leather coat, we thought he was quite cool. But we soon learned that he knew far more than we knew or would ever know probably about African-American culture. And that course changed the direction of several careers, certainly mine. Werner soon produced his first book, a path-breaking study of the former Leroy Jones, Amiri Baraka. And the rave reviews persuaded Columbia to offer this hippie a full-time job. Well, not too surprising, actually. I mean, he did have a PhD from Freie Universität and had studied with some of Europe's leading Americanists. Eventually, he was hired away, as so many cutting-edge professors were in those days, and by Harvard. Years later, when I became the Mellon Fellow in African American Studies there, Werner had been named the department chair, so we rekindled our friendship and our conversations about African American and ethnic literature. But he also turned me on to MELUS. I'd never heard of it. MELUS, what's that? And he had some copies of the journal he shared with me. And he helped me with my first really big publication, Theories of Ethnic Humor, that came out in American Quarterly. That's still the most cited thing I've ever written, despite my books and so forth. The lodestone for all of us, though, after he got rolling with his work was Beyond Ethnicity, Consent and Descent in American Culture, came out in 1986. And he brought together the most far-reaching and provocative arguments for the validity and centrality of ethnicity, arguing persuasively that all American literature was ethnic. I mean, it ranged from Tocqueville to post-punk science fiction and so forth. And I'm sure a lot of you have used it extensively. But he's just been a fountain of energy. His most recent books are The Temptation of Despair, Tales of the 1940s, which concerns Germany after World War II. African American Writing, A Literary Approach, 2016, and Challenges of Diversity, Essays on America, 2017. He's also supervised and edited a collection of the late Jeff Ferguson's work, which we're going to hear about in a really great session later in the conference. He's also co-editor with Grail Marcus of the New Literary History of America, and another monumental book, Neither White Nor Black, Yet Both, Thematic Explorations of Interracial Literature, 1997, is really what really started the mixed race renaissance in critical theory. And finally, among all his other books, I'll mention Ethnic Modernism, which I extensively in my own work. He's also been an incredible mentor to so many people. He's never been too busy to press the case for a struggling scholar up for tenure, the many good causes he's championed in the ongoing cultural wars. And he's provided me and countless others with a steady source of challenge, inspiration, and brilliance in equal measure. And I like to say, as Zora Neale Hurston said about her godmother, and he's my godfather, he hauled the mud to make me. So he's here, speaking from Venice. Let's welcome him, and then I'm going to ask a few questions that I hope will be provocative. Okay. As I mentioned, Werner, you turned me on to MELUS. I don't know if you remember that, but what would you say are the major achievements of MELUS, the society, and also the journal?
Before answering the question, I have to thank Joe. Thank you for setting this whole thing up, and Stacy to make all the technology possible that we're wherever we are and we somehow are connected. So thank you very, very much. Yes, I remember that. I remember the first stapled issues of MELUS, and also meeting Catherine Newman, who introduced me to the whole ambiance of MELUS. Coming from the outside to the United States, I was always interested in the ethnic heterogeneity of the United States that contrasted so much with European self-definitions of a nation state that has one language, one people, putative shared origin. It didn't actually seem to be true, but it was at least a generally accepted fiction. There were very few essays that you could get hold of if you were interested in that topic. One of them that I found very helpful then was by Daniel Aaron. It came out in the Smith Alumni Quarterly, so it was really as well hidden as could be, called The Hyphenate Writer in American Letters. And then came, this was already in the 60s, the Dan Aaron article. And then came Catherine Newman, I think at first, with the anthology that I thought was really important, the American Equation, literature in a multi-ethnic culture. So also that the term circulated more, that came out in 1971. And then we had more anthologies. Edward Ivkovich, who was an advisee of Jules Shemetsky, who also was my dissertation advisor, put together another anthology called American Letter, Immigrant and Ethnic Writing. Bram Weber wrote an essay called Our Multi-Ethnic Origins and American Literary Study in 1975. Catherine Newman gave me that essay that was with a dedication to Catherine Newman, the first off-print of that essay from 1975, in which he stressed the importance of languages being included in the study of multi-ethnic literature. So then I think one more thing I want to mention, because this is all in the context of the so-called ethnic revival of the 1970s, a conference in Texas Tech that produced ultimately 2 volumes, Ethnic Literature since 1776. So a lot happened in the first half of the 1970s that put the whole field onto the table. And MELUS certainly was a very, very important feature in it. I think one of the brilliant structures of MELUS was that it was not based on a single ethnic group, but was multi-ethnic from the start. And that had the advantage from the beginning that many conflicting ethnocentrisms could correct each other. There's always a danger when you are in a single ethnic group meeting. The one danger is filiopietism, the other danger is mudslinging from the inside, but you get into sometimes also predictable types of battles. And I think by setting it up that way, you first raise the question, was there really only one access, a royal access that came with your own background to be able to understand the text? Or was it possible that these texts would travel across, and so that somebody who had Finnish ancestors could also read somebody who only had Swedish ancestors, or even greater splits. So there were interesting discussions, sometimes very blunt, and it was active. It had a raw quality to it. When you went to the meetings, somebody might say, for me, Hawthorne is ethnic, and Mario Puzo is just American literature. So, because I come from where Puzo comes from, and so. So when you think of that beginning, from the stapled little newsletter to the JSTOR quarterly format, to the thorough professionalization, to the enormous growth of the organization, and also the very, very serious scholarship that has come out of it, and that so many chairs of MELUS have steered through it, it is quite a success story that this association has come through.
Well, my second question is kind of related to what you said, because you started your career working on African-American literature, but then branched out to consider almost all other ethnic literary traditions in the United States. And I think you've answered what prompted that change, but was your expertise in African-American a good starting point for this expanded work? And if so, why?
Yeah. Well, because you compare. I mean, it's a very easy thing. For me, one crucial experience was team teaching with Jules Shametsky, a course that was called Broadening the Canon. So that also had the whole period flavor of the 1970s to it. And I noticed simply empirically similarities in writing strategies between writers that Jules knew really well. Abraham Kahan was the big writer. He was working on a book about him at the time. And for example, Charles Chestnut and James Weldon Johnson, whom I had studied. I took a course on African-American literature with Robert Bowen, and my master's thesis advisor was Charles Nichols, who was an African-American expatriate in Europe, who taught American literature in a completely utopian integrated way. He never taught a separate course on Black literature, but he put African-American writing into everything that he taught. So I think just seeing the parallels of imagining an audience that is outside the group, so there's some kind of translation that has to go on, and also the parallel of the success story of David Levinsky and the success as failure story of the ex-colored man seemed to invite comparison. So it came directly from the experience of teaching these texts. But then Dan Aaron, whom I mentioned before, he was asked to write an essay, supposed to be like an 80-page essay on ethnicity and American literature for the Harvard Encyclopedia of American Ethnic Groups. And so he was very kind to me and asked me to take that on for him, that he had already done what he wanted to do on that topic, and why don't I write this? And so I sat for a year, taking out all books that I could get my hands on, and I had to cover as much as possible, the whole gamut, because the encyclopedia included all essays on groups, 108 ethnic groups, but none of the ethnic groups had a literature section in it. So my section was supposed to be the literature section for all groups. It was, of course, an impossible task, but it certainly got me going into thinking more broadly about multi-ethnicity in all kinds of American writing.
That was the first book review I ever did, was of that volume, and it was a task, I'll tell you.
Oh, God.
Your work we've described already, but I wanted to bring everybody's attention to this monumental new study, The Temptation of Despair, Tales of the 1940s, which focuses on your native in the years following World War II. What prompted you to do this book? And why does this volume represent your first examination of your own cultural history? Or maybe I'm wrong. Is it not the first extended examination?
Well, extended, I think you're right. I grew up in Germany. I am German. I have a German PhD. It's obvious that I remained German literature was my second field in graduate school. So I remained always very interested. I wrote some essays about German literature. I wrote also, especially related to the Holocaust, an essay based on the German reception of the American TV series Holocaust. I wrote polemical essays on the issue of immigration in post-war West Germany. But this was the first extended way of going back. And I think I was getting older. I felt this period was tied to my own childhood in a way that that my story was also part of that story. And at the same time, I was in a bi-national situation. I could easily draw on archives, both in Germany and in the United States. And so I imagined a book that would be more a book about the American occupation of Germany. In each chapter, there would be a juxtaposition of a German figure and an American figure. And then the chapter where I really tried that out was a photograph from Life magazine and a German boy in that photograph. It turned out the photographer was British and the boy was Dutch. Sorry. And I just went with what I found. So at the end, the structure isn't what I had imagined it might be, but it got to be a rather somber cultural history because, you know, just when you do, I don't know whether any of you ever do Google Ngram searches. If you do a search for the word Selbstmord, the German word for suicide, and you look for the 20th century, you all of a sudden see, you know, in the 40s to the mid 50s, a very big peak of that word and also of the action that goes along with it. So the sense of depression, what can we do in order to not commit suicide? How can one survive? Klaus Mann wrote a whole book. It was a manifesto for committing suicide. So, you know, the sense of despair that was in the air in the second half and the fourth, I mean, in the 40s, of course, in Nazi Germany, but in the second half of the 40s in the occupied zones was something that captivated me more and more as I was working on it. I hadn't expected it to be so somber, but it turned into a much more somber story than I had imagined at the beginning.
As a footnote to that, some of you were here in Athens when I hosted MELUS some years ago, and you'll remember that Werner was one of the keynote speakers, and Natasha Trethewey was another, and the third was Christina Garcia. That time was writing a book called Here in Berlin, which was going to be about Berlin after World War II. And I took Werner and Christina to dinner one night. They hit it off, and his work and his advice helped her. She thanks him in the acknowledgments to that book, which is quite wonderful. I highly recommend it to all of you. And Amy Moore is here from Ludwig Maximilian. I haven't ever laid eyes on her before, but UGA gave us a grant to do a collaborative project, which was postponed because of COVID, but we are going to do a project that looks at those two works and compares and contrasts them. And we're going to interview Werner and Christina as well, we hope. But anyway, that's a footnote. Over your long career, many new ethnic writers have attained literary prominence and success. Can you name 4 or 5 who, in your opinion, stand out from the others?
Well, I mean, I wrote my dissertation on Leora Jones, and I still think that I was in Los Angeles during the Watts riots. It was my first trip to America, and I ended up in the Watts riots, and I went to a theater where they were showing 2 plays of Leora Jones, Dutchman in the Toilet, and you know, you could literally hear that needle fall on the ground. Everybody was just stunned against the context of violence that was going on outside. The next day, the fire department closed the theater for faulty fire escape or something, but I had a feeling there was something that he captured that was really crucial. So I think of him as a patron saint of a new urgency in literature that came out of the 1960s, also with his connection with the Beat generation that loosened up lots of things. Adrienne Kennedy was a writer I've always liked, a completely different feeling that she evokes. Georgia roots in the background, but growing up in the North and having this exposure to mixed race ancestral stories that go mostly through the mother-daughter line and the different color, and all of that in experimental form, where you have one character who may be, Queen Victoria and Lumumba at the same time, because, all the different things that go on inside you. I think she's very, very good. And all her plays are now being produced in this kind of virtual way in New York. Richard Rodriguez, often embattled because of his stance on bilingual education, I think wonderful in creating a multifaceted way of writing autobiography through different snippets. Take the autobiography from the point of view of religion. Well, the days of the week, the times of the day, everything is organized differently if you do it religiously. Language, we talked about quickly, class, but also the self-examination from the point of view of sexual orientation. I think he handled really, really well. So that, I think, stands out. Tino Villanueva is a Chicano poet who is very much attuned to bilingual poetry production. He's one of the few poets who actually writes poetry both in English and in Spanish. And he never writes the same poem in both languages, because he gives them to translators if they need to be in the other language, because he would end up writing a different poem. Then I think, obviously, Maxine Hong Kingston, wonderful in dealing with the difficulty of making mythologies migrate from one country to another. We all have our past myths and fables and things that a great aunt may have told us. And how does that work in another country? So how does a Chinese story of a woman warrior get transposed into an American context? Jamaica Kincaid, I've found really remarkable how she arrived at a voice that seems so stark and sometimes almost mathematical, and yet creates characters, makes them really vivid. Sometimes you read 2 pages and say, how did she do it? I think just look at the title, The Autobiography of My Mother. I had to laugh when I saw the title. The problem of every autobiography, but to write it like this, The Autobiography of My Mother. And I really consider myself lucky to have met all these writers, to have been able to invite them for readings, to bring them to my classes, to introduce students to them. Hisaya Yamamoto, another one I really liked, who came to Cambridge from California by train. So I always had a phone call every day where she had arrived, and there she was going on, because she didn't fly. And she stayed for 2 days in Cambridge and then took the train back. And wonderful with her quiet reading part of her unpublished stories, and then answering students' questions. And then, of course, I admired the Song of Solomon. And then I was asked to introduce Toni Morrison when she gave the lectures that became the book Playing in the Dark. So that was one of the absolute highlights. I never met Philip Roth, and I guess I will only meet him in hell or wherever we are going. But I really cherish his American trilogy. I think that this is one of those big magnum opus works in which so much of what MELUS has been doing over the decades is almost synthesized in a great fictional form that's finally somebody writing up to the level of Faulkner.
Yeah, another person I know you probably might have added to that list is Gish Jin.
Oh, yes, of course.
I went to Werner's retirement party in Cambridge, and I love her work. So I went up to her and introduced myself, and I said, I've always wanted to meet a legend. And she turned to the lady next to her and she said, well, meet another legend. It was like a Kincaid.
Yeah.
Okay, that was a good list. I want to ask you about literary theory, because a lot of us use theory in our work, but it can be a trap or a tangent, or, I mean, how do you feel about the use of theory in ethnic studies?
Yeah. Well, when I arrived at Harvard, there was a young undergraduate who came to my office, and he said, could I help him with his thesis, because he didn't really have a very good advice with it. And so I said, well, give me the draft of what you have. And I look at it. He said, I can't do that yet. I said, why? He said, I have not yet plugged in Bakhtin. So I said, well, is it necessary? He said, yeah, here you have to, and he didn't know how to plug in Bakhtin. That was the dilemma. So I think that, told me that obviously theory should come from questions that arise as you're engaging with the text, and you have questions. With multi-ethnic literature, you may have questions about what's the nature of prejudice. So that's a whole different set of theories you may go after. But you shouldn't take something that you superimpose onto a text just so that you have the theory part of it. The theory has to come from questions we ask as we read and reread a text, and our ignorance is always enormous, and theory can help us anchor that ignorance in some wider conversation into which one can place the text as well. I find that many studies, when you talk about ethnic literature, the studies are actually driven by thematic interest. We want to find out about the experience of migration or language shift or assimilation or fighting against assimilation or language clash, religious practices, attenuation of religion and intensification of religious practices in later generations, foodways, jokes. John, your old topic of ethnic humor, foodways, the different recipes, how do generations fare? Now, all of these are actually themes rather than formal devices. And I think the question is always, how are these themes rendered in forms? And that's why I think one of the set of theories that actually would be more universally helpful is thematic theory. What do we do when we look for a theme in a text? I once put together a collection of essays. It's my least known book that nobody ever uses, called The Return of Thematic Criticism.
Yeah, I have it.
I tried to get together critics from around the world who have worked in thematic studies. And that, I think, is a helpful general tool to have, because whether you study autumn or falling in love or ethnic situations in fiction or in any genre, then you're really dealing with themes.
Okay, I want to turn to your book, Ethnic Modernism, which delineates the many ways in which multi-ethnic writing has contributed to both modernism and modernity. Do you feel the same has been true for postmodernist text, or do you see any point in that term anymore? A lot of people have abandoned it.
Yeah. Well, the word is an old word. Randolph Bourne used postmodern in his essay, Transnational America. And I think somebody found an instance in 1888 or something.
You mean Jameson didn't invent
it? But it clearly peaked. I did an Google Ngram once, where you see that postmodern peaks from 1980 to 2000. And since 2000, it has almost the same steep decline. So we've reached now about the halfway mark of that decline. So the postmodern term, which always had an uneasy fit with literature outside of the United States. I mean, in France, there was something like Nouveau Roman, and there was experimental writing and many, but postmodern seemed to be a particular mode of approaching literature, let's say centered around Robert Coover, experimental texts of that nature. And there is actually, to my knowledge, not all that much ethnic writing that really fully participates in that. One can say, the early Ishmael Reed, Teresa Cha's dictée, you could put into there, maybe even a little bit of Danticat, Crick Crack. I mean, you can get a course together on saying, multi-ethnic writing and the postmodern. But it seems now, it would would be picking a rather untypical mode, because I think for most ethnic writing that I know, it's a combination of good old realism and touches of modernism, and sometimes a little bit more modernism, that has marked the quality of the writing, and very little of this absolutely pure formal experiment. You know, when the Coover, the story of the babysitter, where at the end you really don't know, did the babysitter kill the baby? Did the employer kill the babysitter? Did anybody die? Was there a bathtub at all? Everything is vague and disappears. And this wonderful language game. It's great to see what our wish to have stories does to us when somebody plays with it. But I don't see that all that much. I don't know whether you have somebody in mind that one should highlight there. And plus, I think it's a sort of fading term in general. It's not.
Yeah, well, I've written about Maxine Hong Kingston as postmodern in Tripmaster Monkey, and compared her to Gerald Visner, who's definitely postmodern.
Yeah.
I don't really disagree with what you're saying. I wanted to ask you too, MELUS has become the home for a lot of scholars who write mainly about their own ethnic groups' literature, but it has always also emphasized the need for cross-ethnic literary projects, and my dear beloved late friend Joe Skerritt always pushed that. Do you think scholars of ethnic literature should make an effort to master more than one ethnic literary tradition, and if so, why?
Yeah, I think I would say, yes, it's a very good idea, because only by comparison do you really learn what makes one tradition specific or what creates shared elements. We already talked a little bit about that when one of your earlier questions. I think the danger of mainstream scholarship was that it was blind to the varieties of American literature, but the danger of a monoethnic focus is obviously filiopietism, nostalgia, navel gazing, or also a particular animosity toward your own group coming from having been raised in it. I just saw that terrible, the Unorthodox TV series. I found a very good example of this, unleashing everything on a context of background. And so I think it's just, you create another blindness toward all kinds of forms of American cultural expression by focusing exclusively on one. And MELUS, is and has always been a very good place to combine approaches that come from American studies. One can look around all disciplines, and from comparative literature, because one looks at literature in comparison to other texts. Any text that we look at has a relationship to other texts, and texts don't usually respect ethnic boundaries.
One of the things I didn't mention about your work is that you, with Mark Schell, founded the Longfellow Institute, bringing forward works written in our country in languages other than English. And you yourself are fluent in several languages. The ones I know about are German, English, French, and Italian, maybe more. Since you've been out over in the Middle East, you probably picked up another one. How large a role has this skill set contributed to your of, and what do you think it's important for scholars of ethnic literature to master at least one other language besides English? Of course, most of us had to do that in graduate school, but I don't know how many of us retained that ability, over the years.
I mean, I think I would start out with Bram Weber's essay again from 1975 about the importance of language. He was looking also at Spanish at that time as a very important second language to at least have a reading knowledge of, and that, you're very kind with all the languages you ascribed to me. I think getting some kind of basic reading knowledge in languages is something really helpful. I think people who study ethnic literature are actually in a very good position, because when you deal with ethnic texts, there's another language always around the corner, whether it's directly inserted into the text, as full-fledged presence. All of a sudden there's a sentence, and what does it mean? Or there's a ghostly presence. It's something is translated from another. I read an English poem that used the phrase dust sucker. Now, that's a literal translation of the German word for vacuum cleaner. But when you say it in English, all of a sudden it has either a poetic or a terrible ring to it. So translated words have a ghostly presence, and there's code switching, there are bilingual puns. Marie Lauré wrote this wonderful book called Wonder Words. What happens with words, they go from one language to another, and ethnic literature is full of those words. So it's very nice if you know the linguistic context of the word, where that comes from. It's certainly helpful. And I think many members of MELUS, I hope that's still the case, have some kind of legacy languages. There's some great aunt or some grandmother who still speaks it, but I don't speak it. And I think that's a good moment to, wrap up at least that much, that one understands maybe the writings of relatives who are no longer alive, or the speeches of relatives, even if they're hard to understand and hard to figure out, in order to get some form of bilingualism going that is also family related. I think that seems to be such an easy way to approach that topic. I find it shameful simply that humanists in the 1960s have resigned to abandon language requirements so that one has to deal with graduate students who have gone through high school and college without becoming fluent in a second language. And I think it's the only Western country in which that is the case. So I think the ethnic scholars are in that advantage that there's very often an effective relationship to another language, which is always helpful. I had a colleague who really was multilingual, the way you describe it to me, who could sing opera in Italian, have a fluent conversation in French, know Russian, and so on. I said, how do you do it? He said, it's girlfriend. And you know 12 languages. So that affective issues come into language acquisition, but affection comes also, without the girlfriend dimension that he had, but just you continue a family tradition with some, not the full expertise, but some attempt to flourish in that different linguistic medium.
Yeah, I'm going to backtrack a little bit to Beyond Ethnicity, 1986. I mean, when that book came out, I was kind of surprised that some critics said that you had not emphasized race enough, which I found astonishing because I knew that was one of your central concerns. But was that a fair criticism in any way? And in 2021, how would you characterize both the distinctions of these terms and race, consent, descent, and race, in which ways they overlap?
Well, I thought of the word ethnicity as containing a lot of problems in it, because it's derived from the Greek word ethnos and derived from the Bible translation of the Hebrew goy. And so the idea is always it's people in general, but also it's others. One of my friends said, oh, so an ethnic is a goy. So do I know that? So an ethnic is always someone who's not like us, but ethnicity is always something that we also share as people. So there is an ambiguity about difference and sameness that's embodied in the word. And the result of it is that when we say, I study ethnic literature, and you say, I'm writing a dissertation on Roth, somebody may say, he's not ethnic, he's just American. So what does that mean? Where do you draw a boundary? And race is another whole compounded problem of a similar structure as ethnicity, only that people believe it's more real, or that the effects that it has are more real than ethnicity. But that also, I think, is an American idiosyncrasy. Generally the form, whether we draw on skin color or we draw on other differentials, is always similar, how outgroups are created using particular physical markers and shared ideas of ancestry and so forth. So I was at a conference where I met a young scholar, Janet Dolgen, who was working with David Schneider on kinship theory. She later on became a lawyer and gave that whole thing up. But I was really inspired by that, thinking of all relationships as either being by law or being by blood, so that you have a kind of descent line through which you define yourself and a consent line, a lateral relationship. Now, as you know from your own parents, you can't have children without consent relations. And on the other hand, you come from somewhere. So no matter how you say, no, that's not who I am, I define myself completely different. I found out at age 12 that I'm really not at all my parents' child, and so forth. Nonetheless, the people outside will say, well, your parents are still there, or your mother is still there, or something like that. So I think the dialectical relationship between consent and descent, I thought, is a way for us to be able to address a whole social fabric. And it's something that really gets activated because ethnic boundaries come in because you have a descent or a putative descent that distinguishes you. And ethnic violence very often comes on by consent relations across that boundary. And that I think makes the virulent side, where is the virulence strongest, is reactions against people who don't have my ancestry, and reaction against people who mingle with people who don't have my ancestry. That I think is so I thought that the consent descent dialectical relationship, it's not really an opposition, is a good help to also deal with comparative approaches between mainstream and minority writers, because I also never believed in a kind of way that you say, oh, that's all Dreck, everything, what's Hawthorne, what's Melville, that's all, we have the real lifeline to look at. So I think to compare mainstream as well as minority writers. And so I think I also had a section, I don't need to quibble about somebody who reviewed a book 35 years ago, but I did have a long section on ethnicity and race, pretty much near the beginning of the book, in which I also wrote, you asked me about the present moment, that slavery has posed a special problem to interpretations of America and poses a special problem to our enterprise. It's not just a boundary, but one of the most extreme forms of social boundaries between people, people who consider themselves full human beings and cast others into the category that Orlando Patterson has described as social death. And so when American historians today discuss slavery, they encounter the problem that it contradicts so many of their generalizations of American life. And I think one sentence that I'm still pretty proud of is that the concepts of the self-made man and of Jim Crow had their origins in the same culture at about the same time, whereas aristocratic societies had no need for either. I think that I was trying to be a little bit Tocquevillian in saying, what is it about democratic societies that may particularly generate both a concept of racial segregation and a concept of radical individualism and self-making.
Okay, one might posit, I'm sure this was not what you were thinking, but the big book after that was Neither White Nor Black, But Both, which definitely focuses on race. And it was a watershed in mixed race studies, which have exploded in the years since that book came out. Do you see any new applications for your work in today's culture when there's so many more people of mixed race and not just black and white? I mean, there are every combination known to man.
Right, sure. Well, this goes back again to the earlier question about, how, what's the role of Black writing within multi-ethnic writing? What's the role of African-American studies in the whole ensemble of ethnic studies? I think when legislations in the United States try to develop miscegenation bans, the strongest ones were always against black-white mixes, but then there were many that piggybacked onto that legislation that was already in existence. The easiest way to do it, many states have incest taboo, and so you always say marriage is forbidden by too much affinity or too much distance, and then you could define the distance the way you wanted. I think Arizona defined so many different groups that nobody could marry anybody for 3 years until they finally fixed the law, because when you have a clear binary, it's very easy to say, nobody can marry anyone with any ascertainable trace of African ancestry, which raises the whole question of what's ascertainable, what's African ancestry. There were legal cases of people who said, well, yes, I have African ancestry, but is it really ascertainable? How pure does the African ancestry to be? You would have to prove that my grandfather was 100% African. And so lots of craziness in there. But I think one effect that the whole multiracial movement has had, that's an important effect, is that the census has changed and permits a kind of self-identification of more than one group. That was, I think, quite an accomplishment. So he ended up with, I think, about 7,000 Americans who define themselves as members of all groups that the census gives you as a choice. I'm sure some of my students among them. And then people who took other kinds of double forms. The census also stopped predicting that all people in the future prediction of the American population, the predictions used to be that anyone who marries will marry someone of their own, one of the 5 categories that the census had set up of groups that exist. So if you are a Cuban refugee in the United States, you will marry a Latino, and all your children and their grandchildren will marry other Latinos. The statistics of intermarriage are so high that this is clearly changed. I think the Obama years were probably the big years when Obama himself highlighted his biracial background as a metaphor of America. Where but in America would I even be possible, as one of his raps that he often did. But he also sounded therefore a kind of conciliatory and hopeful aspects of interracialism. In the Trump years, I think we have gone in the opposite direction. And I think at the moment, it seems we're again very, very clearly in an either or situation of white or non-white. And so, you have people of color now as the category that comes in and joins the black, but the idea in an absolute and perennial either or, I think, is strong and also radiates far beyond the United States. I mean, one doesn't have to think, even today when, I just heard that Prince Philip had died, think of Harry and Meghan Markle, and what the tabloids did is like a chapter in neither black nor white. I mean, the worry about a birth of a baby that could be darker even than the mother, that kind of in the royal family. So that, of course, also a big issue of purity, of consent relations that bring out that kind of hostility, and the descendant of that consent relation highlighting the problem of the association. So I think Jeff Ferguson was the first that I heard call Trump America's first white president. Then I think many other people latched onto that coinage, but there was something about the re-articulation of a strong whiteness position that is formulated in antithesis to all other ways of being.
Okay. I have a question for you. All white scholars who work on African American studies, or any scholar who works on whatever their ethnic group, works on the writing of another ethnic group, occasionally gets asked, what interested you in this? Why, and which really means, why are you writing on this group that you don't belong to? I think we all have had that question. I've never had it from an African American, but I've had it from members of other ethnic groups. And I'm sure you're familiar with this. And if so, how have you answered it? And what have you said to your students too, when they announce their plans to study the literature or culture of an ethnic group to which they do not belong by descent?
Yeah. Well, I mean, when you go to university and study humanities, you could choose classical philology, and nobody speaks a language that you speak. It's impossible to deal with things that are only like you. But I think the short answer is, I always went for things that I really felt were interesting, that I was passionately interested in sometimes. And I have encouraged students to do the same. Sometimes you have a student who comes and says, is this the kind of thesis that would get me tenure in 5 years? I say, well, are you convinced by it? Is it something, is that the only angle through which you look at it? But I think the more elaborate answer is that I think there are advantages and disadvantages to being an insider as well as to being an outsider. If you're an insider, certain advantages, you just know things, some things that appear in the text. If you're an outsider, you have to learn them, all the dreary footnotes about Stettel or something, okay, now I got it. So, which by the way, didn't appear in English until 1948, the word Stettel. There was no Jewish immigrant text in English before then. And so that's clear. And an outsider sometimes sees a whole configuration. You walk into a room and you see there's some conversation going on. They don't actually know what they're talking about. It's something for which you already have a name. That's quite possible. So there are advantages and disadvantages. And so what I have passed on to many of my students is Robert Merton's wonderful essay called Insiders and Outsiders. And the essay ends with a great formulation. Insiders and outsiders in the domain of knowledge unite. You have nothing to lose but your claims. You have a world of understanding to win. So I think on that manifesto, we can all sail on, and it could be a quiet manifesto of MELUS as well. One could also paraphrase it with Billy Wilder's "Nobody's perfect." We all have our flaws as insiders or outsiders. It's impossible to be an absolute insider. You write a dissertation on Philip Roth, and you were born in Newark, and you lived down the block from him, and your aunt was in the same shul, and so you still don't. You're not inside Philip Roth. I'm sorry. So there is no such royal direct access, and so a little bit of modesty in saying nobody's perfect. Nobody really has that complete inside knowledge. Maybe God has it in all of us, but we don't.
I have one final question for you on my list. How much time do we have left, Joe?
We have about 10, 15 minutes. And also if people want to throw some questions in the chat.
Yeah, well, I think there are a lot of questions in the chat, actually. My final question to you, and you sort of answered it at the beginning of our conversation. I mean, you've been such a wonderful mentor to so many people. And I wonder if you could give us the names of some people who were really important mentors for you. You've already told us about Jules, who's a friend of mine too. And I see immediately how powerful that influence was. Who are some of the others?
Well, I had a very unusual high school in the 1950s into the 1960s. In Germany, you go to high school for 9 years, not because you're particularly slow, but that's just how the whole thing was structured. And so many of my teachers were actually, they had PhDs, they were scholars, they published books. And several of them became professors when universities opened up, new universities were founded, and so forth. So the seriousness of doing research already, at like middle school level, I think was sort of just hit into you. At the same time, they were also modernists in a way that they would say nobody can know everything. So you have to have the courage to have gaps. Was one of the Mut zur Lücke, I remember. Courage to have gaps. Don't think you have to cover everything, but what you do cover, go into it deeply. That sort of was a maxim. We had a high school teacher who just sent us out for in social science a class to, go around Frankfurt and go to bookstores, secondhand bookstores, and see what we could find about the Nazi period, which was, in the very recent past. And later on, I read that in many schools, teachers didn't even dare to go to that topic. And, he went, Franz Hebel is his name, he went to that full time. And so we had a whole year on National Socialism, Holocaust. This was in 1961. I mean, it was really, there was the Eichmann trial. I mean, just lots of things that came already in high school. And then when I went to the university, I was really lucky to work with some very, very good people. Peter Sondy was a very important person for me. He was the head of comparative literature. He arrived in Berlin shortly after I started studying there. And I took several seminars with him and lecture courses. A meticulous man who would walk into the class, and he still started lecturing as he took off his raincoat and hung it up. And at the end also he would continue talking while he was putting on the raincoat and leaving the classroom, but with an intensity that was just extraordinary. And I only recently found out that he was always called the Swiss professor of comparative literature, but he was Hungarian born, Peter Sondy, and his family was in Hungary when the Holocaust was about to happen, but they managed to go on an exchange. There was an exchange with prisoners of war and Jews in Hungary who were taken to Switzerland, but not directly. They were taken to Bergen-Belsen, to the concentration camp. So he spent 3 months in Bergen-Belsen until the exchange, something he never mentioned in his life. Anyway, and he introduced me to Benjamin and Paul Celan, and there also Hermetic poetry. We did T.S. Eliot and Mallarmé in a seminar. It was very, very important. And then Ursula Brumm, I have to mention too. I mentioned Charles Nichols already as my MA thesis advisor. Ursula Brumm, we had our political battles because along my studies in Berlin, the 60s happened, and I was, as you described me at the beginning, very much in that 60s mode. I participated in sit-ins and so forth. And Ursula Brumm was very conservative and worried about all that. But she taught a course on Puritanism that really was a shaping force for me, with a very meticulous. We had the Miller-Johnson anthology of the Puritans, and read from beginning to end, and did 2 papers and oral presentations on all these damn Puritans with their crazy English writing and all the Greek and Peter Ramus annotations, and so. And she did it. You just had to go on, plug through it, and do it. So that I think was very important. And her big theory was that much American writing was typological in nature, so that it applied biblical models to writing. And so I picked that also up a little bit in Beyond Ethnicity, that so many people are born on Christmas Eve and die on Good Friday, and so there's a little bit of a complex in that direction. I also have to mention Sakwan Berkovich, who was one of your teachers as well. I was already a full-fledged leather coat wearing junior professor when I met him, but he meant everything to me as a colleague at Columbia, and just as a natural event. I remember when the first time I met him, I was so in awe that the Puritan Origins of the American Self had just come out, and I was looking up in the dictionary, was soteriological, what that meant, and I was fully prepared. And then he sat down and said, had I seen the Stepford Wives? And I then came a half-hour exegesis of the line, "I'll die if I can't get the recipe," and the brilliance of so I thought, this is my kind of guy. He went deeply into something that was completely off the kind of thing that he would think of from a highly respected scholar. So I think that I pretty much, Charles Nichols, I mentioned Ursula Burm, Peter Sondy in Berlin, and Jules, of course, as my great dissertation advisor, who really read my dissertation line by line, and I tried to do that with as many students as my eyesight could handle that. And just the Jules always, being there, whatever you can call something, and he'll be there and will answer it and deal with it. I was lucky.
We're lucky, yeah.
Yeah. Well, we do have 2 questions from the chat. John, do you have some others, or should we move to
No,
those?
I'm done. Thank you so much, Werner. That was
Thank you.
for all of us.
Yeah, Werner, if you have time for just the 2 more. So Christina Stanchu, who's our membership chair at MELUS, asks, how do you imagine the future of MELUS in 10, 20, or 30 years? And what advice do you have for graduate students in attendance now? Which actually follows up very nicely on the tribute you gave to some of your own advisors.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you're the better judge to see what's happening at the association from the inside. I just think the growth and also the growing professionalization, I think, as I said, the newsletter at the beginning also included some pretty raw material, that was there. I think is a sign that the kind of stuff that started in the 70s has taken off in leaps and bounds. I think as long as there are ethnic groups, which they don't seem to be going away, there will be the need for some people to study and the literature and culture surrounding ethnic groups, or even the disappearance of some ethnic groups or the appearance of new ones. Mormons are a group that emerged in the United States. So that I think that is important to realize. I think at this moment too, I would highlight the connections between what is right now built as a deep boundary, that is the people of color and not of color, a strange construction that is going on right now. Indigeneity. I think I was thinking before when John was asking me about the race question, do you want to call the society MELUS and say multi-ethnic racial literature of the United States to put it in, but then you don't have indigeneity. The moment you start opening, you don't say, well, I mean ethnic in a broad sense, and just, I don't want it to be defined too tightly. That gives you a lot of leeway. And I think that's true for the students who work on it too. If you, say, I'm working on 3rd generation language loss about Finnish laborers in downtown Chicago. That's a good question for a sociolinguist for a single essay somewhere, but that's not going to build your career in academia. It's too minuscule an enterprise. So if you think of big questions, you can also deal with those big questions in small settings. But one should certainly have in view always the American totality, the story of the founding, the story of the indigenous people, the story of slavery, and the story of all the migrating groups or the groups to whom America came, like in the Southwest. So that I think is the way the country works, and so therefore multi-ethnic literature of the United States is actually American literature. So.
Awesome. Thank you. And as a final question from one of our members, Ren Romero, he asks, pointing out that you're the editor of the Norton Critical Edition of the Narrow of Tradition. He wants to know what thoughts you have about the January 6th armed insurrection at the Capitol. Do you think that's a useful text for unpacking that event?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you. Ron is
Ren.
Ren. Thank you very much for the question. That was something where in putting together a Norton Critical Edition, I learned a lot, because you have all of a sudden, I think I have 250 pages of collateral material, and all the stuff that this Wilmington riot and how precise Chestnut was in actually getting the mood of that violence of the moment. And again, it's a violence against someone who, claimed that the white women are easy. Like, oh my God, so all brouhaha. Okay. I mean, I was horrified. I watched it live, the January event, and in being always a democratic believer, I thought, well, the next thing would be that everybody would, of course, give up this stupid thing of recounting the votes. Everybody knew that was a lie, and so forth. And to see that that still lingers on, and that it's such a really weird thing could happen. I think the impeachment hearings were very good for the simple reason that they showed all this assembled footage. The editors of the film stuff, they were fantastic, I would say, to really show the whole threatening dimension. This was really going for blood. And it's not mass blood, but it was enough blood to create a sense of frightening commonality. So yeah, I think there certainly were. It's a good moment to teach the marrow of tradition, to look at the possibility of an end of something. Fortunately, we right now also have the possibility of a beginning of something else. But I think in January, it really looked pretty grim.
Wow. Wow. Well, thank you so much. As we come to an end, all I can say is if you and Philip Roth both wind up in hell sometime, I can't imagine a better place for conversation than the two of you going at it. And I'll include John, though, wherever you wind up as well, John. May it all be long off for all of us. But thank you all so much for joining us.
Mark Twain said that heaven is good for the weather, but hell is better for company.
Well said. Thank you. Thank you all of you who joined us. Really, what a remarkable opportunity to have a keynote like this, to bring together this virtual conference into a conversation like that, and to bridge the sometimes unbridgeable gap of computer and person. Werner, to get a glimpse of all that you think and the way your mind works is such an opportunity. And John, thank you for shepherding that. That's really wonderful.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Everyone stay safe. Thank you. I hope you continue to enjoy the conference.
Let me jump on and just remind everybody to get to the afternoon sessions. You'll go back in through Whova for the afternoon links, and you'll go back into the hallway just like you have this morning. And then tonight we'll have the happy hours. Those links are also in Whova. And I did just want to plug the New Orleans conference next year. Again, we hope to see you all in person next year. Okay, thanks.